By late afternoon, the illusion finally snapped. What had been whispered about in court filings and speculated over by analysts turned into something unmistakably real. Court-appointed receivers arrived at Trump's most iconic property and took control. Not symbolically, not temporarily. Operational control, staff, finances, bookings, access, all of it. And with that transfer of authority came an order that cut deeper than any fine or headline ever could. Trump was required to leave. This wasn't just another asset under pressure. This was the center of gravity. For years, this estate had served three roles at once. It was a luxury club generating cash. It was a personal residence. And it was the visible nerve center of Trump's post-presidency world, the place where power was projected, loyalty was performed, and the image of dominance was carefully maintained. Losing control of it isn't comparable to losing a hotel or a golf course. It's losing the anchor that held the rest together. The seizure didn't happen out of the blue. It was the mechanical outcome of unpaid judgments that had crossed the point of negotiation. More than $500 million in enforceable court orders remained outstanding. No bonds were posted, no cash appeared. Appeals dragged on, but enforcement moved faster. Creditors stopped waiting and asked the courts to do what courts exist to do: collect, and the courts agreed. Receivers weren't sent in as a spectacle. They arrived the way these things always happen, quietly, professionally, armed with paperwork rather than weapons. They presented orders. Authority shifted instantly. The people who worked there were informed who they now answered to. Members were notified that payments and communications no longer went through Trump's organization. The revenue stream that once fed the brand was rerouted toward satisfying judgments. Then came the hardest line in the order: the owner could not remain. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Business empires can survive losing assets. People rationalize it. They spin it. But being forced out of your own residence because creditors have taken over doesn't leave room for narrative gymnastics. It's a moment that strips away status and replaces it with something far colder: enforcement. This property had long been treated as untouchable, protected, special. But the legal argument that finally broke through was simple and devastating. A commercial operation does not get the same protections as a private home. Revenue, membership, staff, events, those facts turned symbolism into liability. Once that line was crossed, the door opened for seizure. From a creditor's perspective, the choice was obvious. If you're trying to recover hundreds of millions quickly, you don't start with minor assets. You go straight for the one that can generate the most value, the fastest. The crown jewel falls first, not last. And when it does, everything else changes. Because this isn't about one property changing hands, it's about what that property represented: the headquarters, the image, the place that made the empire feel permanent. Once that's gone, the remaining pieces stop looking like a structure and start looking like inventory. What happened today wasn't dramatic in the cinematic sense. No barricades, no chaos. Just the steady application of rules that had finally run out of patience. The kind of moment that doesn't need commentary because the message is self-evident. When creditors take your flagship, they aren't negotiating anymore. They're finishing the job. To understand why this outcome became unavoidable, you have to stop thinking in terms of politics and start thinking in terms of math. Courts don't care about symbolism, but creditors absolutely do. When a debtor owes hundreds of millions that are immediately due, and there is no liquid cash to cover those obligations, the law doesn't ask what the asset means. It asks what it's worth and how fast that value can be turned into payment. That's where leverage turns from a growth tool into a trap. For years, Trump's business model relied on controlling very expensive assets with relatively little actual equity. That strategy works beautifully when values rise. Refinancing is easy, and lenders are willing to roll debt forward. The illusion of wealth grows faster than real cash, and as long as nobody demands payment all at once, everything looks stable from the outside. But judgments change the rules. Court-ordered debts are not suggestions. They are deadlines, and deadlines headlines expose the difference between assets on paper and money in hand. Real estate is valuable, but it's slow. You can't sell it instantly without taking a hit. Creditors know this. That's why once patience runs out, they stop waiting for voluntary sales and start forcing them. From the moment the judgments became enforceable without bonds, the clock started ticking. Every week that passed without payment increased the risk that assets would be moved, shielded, or devalued. From a legal standpoint, that risk justified aggressive action. Receivership isn't punishment, it's control. It exists to prevent value from leaking away while creditors wait. And this property was the obvious first target. It combined everything creditors look for in a seizure: enormous headline value, global name recognition, steady operating income, and a buyer pool wealthy enough to absorb a forced sale. Selling smaller assets first would have taken longer and yielded less. Taking the centerpiece sends a message and accelerates recovery. That's why the argument about protections failed. Once courts determined the property functioned as an active commercial enterprise, the idea that it should be shielded like a private home collapsed. Revenue-generating assets don't get emotional exemptions. They get appraised. What followed was procedural, not personal. Receivers took over accounts. Payroll shifted. Vendors were told where invoices now went. The club kept operating, but for a different beneficiary. Every dollar earned from that point forward flowed toward satisfying debts, not sustaining a lifestyle. For Trump, this wasn't just a financial blow, it was the collapse of a command center. This was the place where he controlled optics, access, and narrative. Without it, the remaining assets lose their coherence. There's no hub anymore, just scattered properties waiting their turn, and that's the part most people miss. Empire collapse isn't loud, it's sequential. Once the first major seizure happens, other creditors move faster. They see proof that courts will act decisively. They stop negotiating and start filing. The process feeds on itself. Each enforcement action makes the next one easier. Resistance weakens. Time runs out. This is why losing the flagship changes everything. It turns what might have been framed as a dispute into a liquidation cycle. And liquidation cycles don't reverse themselves. What happened today wasn't the end. It was the signal that the endgame has begun. Once a receivership takes hold, the rules of survival change. The goal is no longer preservation of image or continuity of control. The goal is extraction of value. That distinction is brutal for anyone whose power depended on perception more than liquidity. From this point forward, every asset is evaluated the same way. How quickly can it be converted to cash, and how much will it yield under pressure? Sentiment doesn't enter the equation. History doesn't either. The process is mechanical. And that's precisely why it's so destructive to empires built on symbolism. This is where leverage shows its second face. When assets are financed heavily with borrowed money, equity is thin by design. Thin equity is efficient during expansion, but it vanishes fast when values fall or obligations spike. A property doesn't need to lose much value before the owner's stake is wiped out entirely. Once that happens, the owner isn't a steward anymore. They're an obstacle between creditors and recovery. That's why control was removed. The receiver's mandate isn't to protect reputations or maintain traditions. It's to stabilize operations, preserve revenue, and prepare assets for disposition. Every decision is filtered through that lens. Staffing levels are reassessed. Contracts are renegotiated or terminated. Non-essential expenses disappear. Anything that doesn't increase sale value gets cut. For the business, this feels like suffocation. For creditors, it's discipline. The psychological impact of this stage is often underestimated. Losing ownership on paper is one thing, losing authority in practice is another. When staff no longer answer to you, when accounts don't require your signature, when access depends on someone else's approval, the power dynamic flips completely. The empire stops being yours in any meaningful sense long before the auction hammer falls. And that flip has consequences beyond the property itself. Partners start recalculating. Licensees examine exit clauses. Joint venture counterparts look for legal separation. Everyone wants distance from a collapsing center because they know what comes next: cascading claims. Once a flagship asset is seized, other creditors feel safer acting. The fear of overreach disappears. Enforcement becomes normalized. This is how liquidation accelerates. It doesn't matter how many properties technically remain on a balance sheet if none of them are protected by liquidity. Each one becomes a candidate. Each one can be targeted. And because forced sales typically fetch less than open market transactions, more assets must be sold to cover the same debt. The math feeds on itself. At this stage, time becomes the enemy. Appeals continue, but they don't stop the machinery. Receivers work on court timelines, not political ones. They prepare valuations, line up buyers, and move methodically toward sale. The longer it takes, the more costs accrue, the less flexibility remains. What's unfolding isn't chaos, it's convergence. A system designed to collect is doing exactly that, step by step, without commentary. There's no need for drama when the outcome is determined by arithmetic. Debt exceeds liquid capacity. Enforcement follows. Control transfers. Assets convert to cash. That's not persecution. That's process. And once the process reaches this stage, the question isn't whether the empire can be saved. It's how much, if anything, will remain after the numbers finish speaking. What makes this phase irreversible is that it strips away optionality. Before receivership, there are choices: delay, refinance, restructure, spin. After receivership, there are procedures. And procedures don't improvise. Every remaining asset now exists on borrowed time. Not because someone is angry, but because the system is shifted from negotiation to execution. Creditors no longer ask if they'll be paid. They ask how fast. And the answer to that question dictates everything that follows. This is where the structure of a leveraged empire becomes its own undoing. When most value is tied up in property rather than cash, every forced sale comes with a penalty. Auctions compress timelines. Buyers know sellers can't walk away. Due diligence is shortened. Discounts widen. A property that might command top dollar in a calm market becomes a bargaining chip under pressure. Multiply that effect across a portfolio and losses compound quickly. That's why the first seizure is never the last. Once the flagship is gone, the psychological dam breaks. Other creditors stop hesitating. Vendors file claims. Lenders enforce covenants. Partners invoke exit clauses. Even small claims rush in, knowing that waiting only reduces their share of what remains. The queue forms fast and it doesn't thin out. At the same time, operational decay accelerates. Uncertainty drives away customers. Members reconsider renewals, events relocate, revenue softens just as costs spike. Receivers respond the only way they can, by tightening controls further. Cuts deepen, flexibility vanishes. The organization becomes a shell designed solely to funnel value outward. This is how empires end without a single dramatic moment. There's no final press conference. No grand announcement, just a sequence of filings, transfers, appraisals, and sales that slowly erase what once felt immovable. By the time the public realizes what's happened, the outcome is already baked in. Attempts to reframe the situation don't land anymore because the audience has changed. Courts read records, not speeches. Buyers read prospectuses, not social media posts. Creditors read bank statements. The tools that once shaped perception stop working when the process is governed by deadlines and signatures. At this point, resistance often becomes performative, loud, defiant, but strategically empty. It may satisfy an audience, but it doesn't change the math. And math is the only language that matters once enforcement begins. What remains is a slow unwinding, asset by asset, claim by claim, each step smaller than the last, each sale yielding less leverage than before. The center has already collapsed, the edges just haven't caught up yet. And when they do, there's no rebuilding phase waiting on the other side, only closure. Because once control is gone and liquidity is exhausted, there is no path back to empire. There's only the accounting of what's left after everyone else is paid. What follows this stage isn't a comeback arc. It's a ledger. When liquidation reaches momentum, the system stops asking who you are and focuses entirely on what remains. Receivers file reports. Appraisers submit numbers. Auctions get scheduled. Proceeds are allocated. Every step reduces uncertainty, and with it, the last space where denial can survive. This is the point where myths finally lose their utility. Claims of vast wealth mean nothing when obligations are due now. Asset lists don't impress when they can't be converted to cash without deep discounts. Influence doesn't help when authority is already transferred. The rules become painfully simple: what can be sold, how fast, and who gets paid first. And that simplicity is devastating to empires built on complexity. The deeper irony is that none of this required a sudden collapse in markets or a once-in-a-century crisis. It required only enforcement. Years of leverage, layered debt, and optimistic valuations can persist indefinitely as long as no one demands settlement all at once. The moment they do, the structure reveals what it really is. From here on, every development follows a familiar pattern. One sale encourages another. Each successful recovery emboldens additional claimants. The timeline compresses. Costs rise. Value leaks away. What once looked like a sprawling enterprise becomes a sequence of transactions designed to close accounts. There's also a quieter consequence that lingers long after the properties change hands: reputational finality. When a flagship falls under court control and sells at auction, the market recalibrates. Future lenders remember. Partners hesitate. The benefit of the doubt disappears. Even if pieces remain, the cohesion that made them an empire does not. This is why the seizure of a centerpiece matters more than any single dollar figure. It marks the moment when preservation gives way to resolution, when control becomes compliance, when power becomes paperwork. The process will continue whether anyone watches or not. That's how systems prove they're real. They don't argue. They don't persuade. They execute. And once execution replaces negotiation, there is no dramatic reversal left to stage, only the closing of books, the settling of claims, and the quiet end of something that once insisted it could never fall.